Hey everyone, a hotly contested topic when it comes to DBD is the horror of the game. It's greatly debated if Dead by Daylight is even a horror game. Of course this can be quickly confirmed by going onto a store page of some kind and seeing the word horror. Despite this, many don't think of it as a horror game. It's viewed like most other multiplayers by many. This, I think, is largely down to how it's presented, and certain features that have made their way in. Today I want to explore the horror of Dead by Daylight. Does it have horror? Did it lose the horror? What even counts as horror? Let's get into it. To start out, I want to look back to the early days of the game, to a time when most would consider the game to be horror. There was a definite tone to the early days of the game. Even from the very first cinematic trailer, there's something very eerie and disturbing about its environment and setup. The way it sounds, the framing, the atmosphere, all feels almost like a horror film. The game is presented with a clear dynamic in mind, with the killer being this imposing force, and the survivors as scared and panicked, even when they're not in the direct presence of the killer. This to many will feel reminiscent of the early days of the game, and is what most look and think back to when they desire the horror of the game returning. I'm sure most of you remember the days of feeling terrified by the sound of the heartbeat, hiding in lockers, and feeling scared what could be around the next corner. These are all relatable experiences for most players. They're things most people have felt or encountered. This part of horror too is largely fear of the unknown. It's what drives most of horror, in fact. The unknown of what's round the corner, what's lurking in the darkness, what is that thing hunting you. It's why when you faced a killer a bunch of times you begin to become relaxed. You know the character now, you know what their power is and what they're capable of. And in a broader sense for gameplay, you begin to adjust to the heartbeat. You become aware that looping is safer than lockers. You know that there's ways to counter each killer you encounter. This, I think, is really the primary reason behind most players not viewing the game as horror. Like any piece of horror media, once you know it, once you've experienced it, it becomes far less horrific. Especially in the case of a multiplayer game that has been around for over 8 years, and many of its players have been playing for likely hundreds or thousands of hours. How can you expect to be that scared of something you are so familiar with? This isn't to say horror can't retain its horror over multiple viewings or sessions, because I actually think there's plenty of horror media that does do that. For example, this opening scene from 28 Weeks Later is one I can watch to this day, after first viewing it over 10 years ago, and I think it's still really scary. I think this is overlooked in Dead by Daylight, this aspect of there still being parts of horror. This is how the game really succeeds, I think, in being a horror game. After all, you're never going to find the game as scary as you did back when you started, but I do bet there's something in game you still find scary, at least a little bit. I can think of a few. Myers or Ghostface staring at you from the distance, a killer suddenly appearing in front of you. This sound effect specifically absolutely gets me. The daunting sound and feeling as the entity grabs someone and takes them into the sky, certain killer lobby moments, and even the eeriness and crackling sound of the campfire. All of these things sort of get to me, because horror and fear are really about these uncomfortable and uncertain feelings. It's not really about jump scares, as fun as they can be. I do think a valid argument is that Dead by Daylight has reduced its horror elements over the years though. I do think this is true. If you compare the maps back then to now, there is a difference. I understand what people mean. The older maps are much moodier and generally darker, and there's a sort of disorderliness to their appearance. Nowadays maps are brighter and there's almost a cleanliness to them, I suppose. They can feel a bit too thought out and more like maps than environments, if that makes sense. They're much more balanced and playable though, which is an undeniable benefit. There's a definite value to the older maps too though. Both old and new have atmosphere, but it's definitely a different kind. Take the old and new Coldwind for example. There was something so grimy and gritty about the old version, this darker yellow color that feels dirty and real almost, where the new version is brighter and clearer, and does definitely have disturbing elements, but they're more to do with the map features rather than the wider atmosphere. I don't necessarily dislike this change though, because I think I would still rather play on the relatively newer version despite this. It's this weird balance where people want the horror back, they want the darker maps back, yet a lot of people also say the current versions are too dark and they'll have these ultra bright reshaders and stuff. This push and pull between atmosphere and gameplay. There was a lot of aesthetic in the older game. Looking into the art book, for example, you can see the consideration for the game to have this grimy and grittiness to it. Lots of the textures have these rough appearances. Even the way many of the add-ons or offerings are drawn are very disturbing almost. However, again, I think this is a product of the game's older state. I think people wouldn't accept this nowadays to some extent. The priority for most long-term players, after all, is they want functionality. They want the game to look good and move well. They don't want the roughness or the jank. They want cleanliness and fluidity. I think therefore a large reason for the game's move away from horror is that it isn't the game's most important aspect. The gameplay is the thing you're primarily interacting with over hundreds of hours. And people might say, well, no, I actually don't mind that. But the thing is, I think most people who say that probably would. Going back to that state from now, it would be a big shift and quite a sizable difference. And is in large part, I think, a nostalgia thing. It's quite unreasonable, I think, almost to desire the game to make you constantly fearful after playing for so long, and I doubt the majority of people who want more horror back would be happy with these maps returning as the norm. Consider another game, say Resident Evil 2. When playing through for the first time, it is horrific. There's clear horror elements and the feeling of fear and uncertainty. But this isn't a game that's meant to be played for years on end. It's likely for many a one-off experience. If someone were to play Dead by Daylight for a few hours back in 2016, they'd likely come away thinking, wow, that was a scary game. They might even say that now, which is a statement a lot of you would consider quite silly if you've played it for much longer. The priority of Dead by Daylight is not with horror though, it's with the gameplay, the interaction between the two sides. It's why more people like Wesker than they do the Hag, even though Hag is almost definitely scarier to face for most people due to her jump scares and sounds. Wesker is a lot more fun in gameplay and interaction. Horror is something people will move on from caring about, but gameplay and the core structure of the game is not, so I think another reason is simply priorities. Gameplay is more of a priority than the horror aspect is. The final big thing, and something I see brought up a lot, is the inclusion of certain elements into the game, elements many view as not horror. There was a whole big deal about this back in the day with the release of the All Kill chapter. This is a horror game, how are we getting this bright K-pop idol covered in neon? Which I think brings up a good point, which is really defining horror, which is something the community still debates to this day. Does Dungeons and Dragons fit horror? Because earlier I said I don't think jump scares are really horror. To me they're more terror or shock really. They're a natural human response to something suddenly appearing, for example. But I bet to some that defines horror. It's something viewed as a key element or requirement to make it a good piece of horror media. In the same way someone might view various monsters differently. Maybe someone finds AI or robots particularly scary, but another person thinks it's dumb or silly. Horror to some is almost goofy and silly. To others it's dark and depressing. This is something I actually studied back in university. I had a specific project myself questioning why I felt so indifferent to so much horror, for the most part. Why am I not finding it scary? But I think it's really about finding what you do find scary. I ended up interviewing a bunch of people, one of them being a 40-year-old father from the US, and he said that he felt very much like me when he was younger, and it was only when he had a kid where horror specifically clicked. If there was something surrounding happening to a character's child, it really affected him and terrified him in a way he hadn't felt before becoming a father. Horror largely is just about your personal fears really. It's why a lot of people lament for the old Dead by Daylight atmosphere. It's sort of a middle ground for horror, a relatable horror aspect most can relate to. The unknown, darkness, uncertainty, and so on. It's human nature to fear these things really. That's why that type of horror is so sought after and desired, I think, by the player base, because it's one most agree on, a common experience between players who remember finding it scary. But if someone comes out and says, wow, I really hope they do another chapter about a public figure secretly doing evil things, that was really scary, it's not as likely to get the same rousing response. Equally, if someone says, I really want another horrific, inexplicable monster, more people react positively, because it's a much more likely thing people will agree on as horrific and scary. People argue about what fits the game. We can't have Five Nights at Freddy's because it doesn't fit the game, despite the fact that we have Clown in a pink elephant costume, or Bunny Legion, or crazy survivor outfits. But all of these things do contain horror. If you look into the elephant costume, it's actually really disturbing and messed up, and visually has creepy features. Maybe some people just find the costume scary, or Clown within it. However you view it though, whether horror or not, there's someone out there who does find it creepy and does find it scary. There's not been a single thing added to this game, in fact, which I would debate could be considered not scary for someone. I don't really think Five Nights at Freddy's is scary either, but it would fit the game. Horror isn't just the surface level. This thing doesn't look scary enough. It adds to it, sure, when it does, but it doesn't define it. A guy going around on Halloween night stalking and murdering people is still horror, even without the creepy mask. It's a very complex genre in this way, I think, because you can't tell someone what to fear. It has to be something they reach by their own means, even as a recent case with a character like the Unknown, who I personally think was made very well and I found quite horrific, but I've seen a bunch of comments saying it's goofy or it's not scary at all, and that's equally valid. One of the reasons I think that character was so successful is because of the way it was presented again, of a character based around the unknown. Again, that horror commonality between most people. So that's sort of my final point, is that people desire this common ground of horror, really. Horror has never left Dead by Daylight, it's still there. I just think people desire for a specific kind of horror that we briefly saw return with the Unknown. The issue is, just having this kind of horror isn't that interesting either. It's important to have variety. It's one of the main things that makes Dead by Daylight so special, is how much variety we have in the game. The variety already present in the game, in fact, is a good argument for the variety present in horror as a whole. This is a genre that is not defined by any one thing. In conclusion, I think Dead by Daylight and horror have always been interwoven, but over the years there has been a definite departure from the game having a clear and united vision of horror, one which is quite a common ground for horror. This though has likely occurred over the years as the game has diversified and as the game has developed, gotten older and priorities shifted, as the game has been played time after time and the desire for gameplay over feel has taken hold. A feeling of nostalgia and a want for the old horror of the game may come back, which I think is valid, but something we will likely not see again to that extent. I do hope you enjoyed, and as always, let me know your thoughts below. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.